Thank you so much, Adeke, for that introduction. I'll have to stand because I'm, challenged for height. So people who are short, for me to project, I have to stand up. But I want to say good evening to you all, and I'm delighted at this invitation by the Center for Conflict Resolution to do this book launch. I had come here for a state visit with my president, which we did successfully on the 6th and 7th of May, and then following with the World Economic Forum, which we've started because Nigeria is going to host it next year. So we came with a strong delegation. And in the midst of all that, Deke said I should come and launch this book here. So I'm privileged, honored, and delighted to do it. And I see an enthusiastic crowd. I'll find out just how enthusiastic in a minute. I don't want to say too much because, as Adeke said, I want to give a chance to people to ask questions. But I want to just say a few words about this book. The first is it's not an autobiography. I don't feel complete enough or, accomplished enough to write an autobiography yet. Maybe my story is not done. I don't know why. People keep saying, why don't you write one? But I'm not ready yet. So what I did really is a book for development practitioners. But I wove into it some stories of what happened to us when we were doing this reform. And I think that the book is applicable not just to Africa, but even to developed countries at this time. Those struggling with how to manage debt, those struggling with fiscal issues, there are lessons that those struggling with the financial sector, there are lessons they could learn here. But mostly, there are lessons about managing reform and what happens. And what I'll do today is maybe share a few anecdotes with you about things that we did well, didn't do so well, and, I think that will give you a flavor. But above all, this book is a book about optimism. And optimism about my country. I never intended to write it, but I went to give a talk at the Council on Foreign Relations in 2005, when we were in the midst of these reforms. And my son, who is a writer, and he's a much more accomplished writer, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, his publisher, his agent rather, Andrew Wiley, some of you might have heard of him, came to listen to the mother of this young man. And when I finished, he said, "You have a book in you." And he pursued me doggedly until I wrote that book. So that's the history. I thought it would take me a year to write. It took 4 years. So here is what it was all about. I was minding my business. No, maybe I shouldn't start. I should say that throughout my career, I had always wanted to give back to my country. That was why I went to the World Bank after all. The idea was to spend 2.5 years there and take back some learnings to Nigeria. I had always wanted to go home. I was schooled and brought up by my parents to give back at home. But I ended up spending 25 years plus. And at some point in my career, I really wanted to go and support what was happening in the country. And President Obasanjo, to cut a long story short, invited me in 2000 to be an economic advisor. And then later on, in 2003, invited me back to be finance minister in his government. And when I went, it meant I had to really look in detail, build up on my knowledge in 2000, to see what was wrong with Nigeria. Why did we have such a reputation? You mentioned Nigeria, people say corruption. People feel pessimistic. People feel it's not going anywhere. You look at the statistics and you found that, for the decade of the 90s, we've been growing at 2.4%, which was slower than population growth. And the country didn't seem to be moving. There seemed to be a pessimism in the air, even after we had left military rule and had a democratic change of government. So we began, so the question to me was, what is it about this economy? Why are people so pessimistic? What can we do? And the more I looked at the challenges, And the more I found the opportunities, if you want to put it that way, and the more I had grounds for optimism. So as we did these reforms, which were very difficult, I decided that, people regard Nigeria as unreformable. And its citizens are the most critical of all. It's like a contradiction. Nigerians are the most, in some senses, nationalistic, proud to be Nigerians outside, but very critical inside and very cynical sometimes. So this was a book designed to tell people, the young people, that it can be done. This country can reform. It is actually possible because we did it. There is hope. Everything is not a challenge. There are a lot of opportunities. And Nigeria is so important that we can't give up. We must reform ourselves, if not for our own sake, for the sake of the rest of Africa. Because what Nigeria does matters in the statistics, the perception of the whole continent. And therefore it was designed to say, this is a story of hope, of ability to do, of the possibility of doing. And in that sense, it's, an optimistic book. And some people might not agree. Some people might not feel so optimistic. But as I give you one or two vignettes of what this is about, then you will understand what I mean. Now, when President Obasanjo said I should come and be finance minister, one of the things we discussed, after having spoken to Jim Wolfenson, who was then president of the World Bank, and who was anxious for me to go and do this job in Nigeria, because just what I said, he said, Nigeria matters too much. If they need you to come and help, go and do it. But please talk to the Brazilians who have done reforms at a difficult time in the 80s and see what you could learn. And it so happened that the Deputy Finance Minister of Brazil, during the time of the reforms, was an executive director at the World Bank at the time. So I went to him and talked to him to learn some lessons. The first thing he said to me is, if you're going to be finance minister and to lead the reforms, you can't do it alone. It must be done by a team. That's one lesson we learned. And you must have a team, and you must build this team, and there must be team spirit so you can support each other, because you'll be subject of attack from inside and outside and everywhere. So when I spoke to President Obasanjo about, it's not just about me being there, but really you need a team of people who can work and support each other, and we need to build this team. He agreed, and he had some names, and some other colleagues of mine who became members of the team, who were working with him, also had suggestions. And to cut a long story short, we came up with a series of some names, taking critical positions, not just in cabinet. We're actually only 3 or 4 in cabinet, but important director generals who were running various parts of the government, government agencies, also became members of this team. And this is a story about how this team, it's not about an individual. When I wrote the book, some people said, yes, she's just going, without reading it, she's going to write about how she did this and that. But when they finally read the book and found out it was all about how this team delivered, led by a president who had a vision, I think he told a different story than what they had expected. So it's a mixture of an economics book along with a development practitioner's book. So the first thing we did was to try and understand the problem, the underlying problem of the Nigerian economy. As I said, people felt it was hopeless, not going anywhere, would never, was corrupt, you couldn't turn it around, etc. So we spent some time, this team, trying to really understand what was wrong. And one of the first things that we saw when we put together a chart, which is my favorite in the whole world, it's at the back of the book. And I'll just be a little bit of economics for a while, and then I'll switch to ordinary language. But this is my favorite chart at the back of the book. What does it show? When we began to study Nigeria's economy from the 70s, we found a phenomenon of a zigzag pattern, very volatile pattern of expenditures, of revenues, expenditures, and GDP growth. There's no country that can develop whose GDP growth seesaws every other year or every year. So with tremendous volatility, economists have actually done studies showing that volatility in the economy takes away serious percentages of growth away from a country's economic growth and development. And in the case of Nigeria, then we must have lost about 3 or 4 percentage points of GDP growth to volatility. What was the cause of that? This was an economy dependent on one commodity, oil, that had turned away from a broad base with agriculture as a mainstay, where we were exporters of agricultural products, and we were able to feed ourselves. And oil was discovered in 1956 but began to boom in the 70s. And this country turned away from this broad-based and focused on that one commodity. And what happened? Of course, the price of the commodity is very volatile. So when oil prices were high, the government spent everything. And when they crashed, it couldn't even pay salaries. It started a number of projects that it was never able to complete because income would go up and down. And for decades, we ran the country like this. And nobody put any mechanism in place to manage this volatility. And without that, you will not be able to stabilize this country and make it grow. So that was the first problem we had to solve. It's so amazing to me now, and sometimes irritating, that Nigerians have now taken it for granted that they have a stable expenditure pattern and a stable macroeconomy. And now they've moved on, and some are even questioning the basis. But we had to put in place a mechanism to do this. What we did, and that's the first chapter, stabilizing the macroeconomy, was to put in place what economists call an oil price-based fiscal rule. This is a fancy name for saying that instead of budgeting at the price of oil, we delinked the budget price. We developed a mechanism to sort out a benchmark price for oil at which we would do the budget that was not linked to the oil price in the market. And we did it at a time, luckily, when oil prices were rising. So we were able, when it was about $33 a barrel in 2004. We budgeted at 25, and that gave us an excess, which we saved in something that we called an excess crude account, the famous ECA you hear about. And when it was $55, we budgeted at 45. We had a model, a very simple, econometric model to calculate 10 and 5-year moving averages to give us the benchmark price. So we didn't just guess it. We had a methodology. And we were able to keep saving this money. But what happened? You now had a smooth pattern of expenditures within government. And you were also able to save, and you then controlled the volatility of your GDP growth. And if you look at this chart, you will see that during the years we were doing it, that smooth pattern emerges with a bump, showing the amount of money we were able to save. At one time it was 11 billion, before we left it was 22 billion, and we allowed it to be managed as part of our reserves. So we were able to build up reserves during this time. When I came, in 2003, reserves were $7 billion. Can you believe that? Not enough to carry us for more than a month or two of expenditures. And we were losing reserves, meaning that our management of our expenditures and our revenues was very loose. Fiscal policy was loose. By the time we put this mechanism in place, we had saved 11 billion, then 22 billion. Our reserves got up to almost 60 billion at peak. And things just changed and turned around for a very sound and stable fiscal policy and macroeconomic policy. And do you know what happened during that time? The economy took off. And from 2.4% on average, it rose to 6 percentage points of GDP growth and kept on growing at that rate throughout the period we were in government. Now, some people will say, growth. We can, in my country, they say, na growth we go chop. You know? But President Lula came the other day from Brazil, where they had enormous inequality. What you need is for the country to both grow and then for you to share and redistribute the pie so that inequality does not continue to rise. You cannot just distribute a pie that is not growing. So you need both. And so to reintroduce growth back so that we could have something to think about how to use to solve our poverty problems, that was one thing we introduced. Now, we haven't been able to do as well at the bottom end of the scale of tackling that inequality, and that is one of the things we are turning our attention to. So the first round of reforms, we had to stabilize the macro, and that's what we did. We also were able to do certain other reforms, begin them within the economy, and I described them. Some of them we were successful at, some we were not. You know, we had, and you know, to be able to get this economy to kick off. So we tried several things, and some of them worked. We needed to do these reforms in any case in order to get debt relief. Remember, I started a little bit with the story of debt. We owed 30 billion to the Paris Club. And President Obasanjo had the vision of getting rid of this debt. So one of the things he told me is, he actually wrote it. I have a letter saying that your job, he sent it to me, sent to every cabinet member a letter. Mine said that my job was to get Nigeria debt relief. And I looked at it. Everybody had been running around looking for debt relief and had not succeeded, including President Obasanjo for some time. And then I had this. When I got that letter, my heart sank because I didn't know if we could do it. But we quickly, with the team, mapped out a way for doing this. And that was to look at those reforms in addition to the macroeconomic stability that we needed to do to deliver this debt relief. We needed to look at some very tough reforms within the economy. We had a state-controlled sector. Many of our sectors were controlled by the state. And for those who believe in socialism, which I think, is, people come up and say capitalism. For me, it's not about capitalism or socialism. It's about what works. And what can you do to be able to help those at the bottom end of the ladder and be inclusive? It certainly does not help people at the bottom end of the ladder if you have state institutions losing money right, left, and center. The little money you should use to build roads, we are using them to plug holes in state agencies, in ports, in power, in telecommunications, and all over. The first thing President Obasanjo supported was the liberalization of the telecom sector by auctioning licenses beginning in 2002 and then going on during the period of the reform. That was one sector we opened up, liberalized, and it was one of the best reforms. Before the reforms, we had 450,000 landlines in the entire country. By the time we opened up the reforms, we can't even keep count anymore. It's said that we now have 160 million GSM lines, right? So it's grown exponentially. Nigerians who never had access to a phone now had it because people came in, licenses were transparently auctioned, they bought it, MTN being one of them, and MTN was making about $360 million net a year during the time profit. During the time I was finance minister from 2004 till 2003 to 2006. So that was a success story. Following that, we tried to open up other sectors. I won't bore you, but we tried to work on the ports. We concessioned the ports with mixed results. We tried to start the privatization of the power sector, but it only went maybe one quarter way. And here in the audience, we have a hero of Nigeria, Mr. Tedo Peter Side is here, who has been leading the work on finally privatizing the power sector. He's the chair of the technical committee of the Privatization Council. And, the story we started then is now complete, or almost complete at this time. We worked on we also worked on things like customs, where we didn't make much inroad because of blockages, and you can read the book and all the anecdotes about vested interests. And I could go on. We tried the civil service and came up short because reforming the civil service is a huge albatross. But we did enough reforms successfully such that when we went to the Paris Club and laid out what we had managed to achieve, we had enormous credibility. And with that, the Paris Club was able to agree, unprecedented, only the second time, the second largest amount they've written off in the history of the Paris Club. They wrote off, they said we should pay 6 billion in arrears we owed them, and that is a condition sine qua non. We did. And then they wrote off 18 billion completely of the debt. Then they said we could buy back the balance, which they had never allowed a developing country to do ever. But we negotiated that, and we bought back the balance for 6 billion, and then we wiped out the entire 30 billion in debt because we had done all these reforms. And Nigeria went from a country, when we had finished, that had a debt to GDP ratio of about 84%. From 30 billion in debt, external debt, we went down to less than 5 billion. You know, so one of the biggest objectives of trying to do the reforms was also accomplished. And this was a major success. Now, it all sounds very nice and simple. But all along the way, it was very difficult. You know, there were issues. There's a whole chapter on corruption. Because yes, this was a problem. And yes, we encountered it in many forms. And what I do in the book is to give you anecdotes of different types of corruption and what we try to do about it. Just one or two anecdotes. One type, we said, where is the corruption hitting the government the most? And what do we have to do to deal with it? It's all very good to talk about corruption. But the essence is to identify where you can actually solve the problem. So this is what we set about doing. Just one example. We identified that public contracts were not being bidded in any competitive way. As a result, we were paying 4 times the cost for an equivalent public contract as our neighboring countries like Ghana. Because we didn't have any open or competitive bidding. So one of the things one of my colleagues in the team did, and we divvied out tasks to the various members of the team, was to develop a public procurement system with open, competitive, international and local bidding. And with that, she was able to help us save about $1.5 billion that would have gone out of the window within the 3 years of the reform. That's just an example. We also tried to tackle the corruption of money fleeing the country. People who had taken out money. President Obasanjo also made this one of his key tenets. And working with him, one of the things we were able to do, and a lawyer outside, was to recover some monies. We're still in that business. We were able to get back $500 million at that time. So we tried to identify the places where corruption was rife. And the president had created 2 institutions, EFCC and Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, an independent corrupt practices commission that were very active at the time. So we coupled trying to tackle the issue with trying to check impunity. And one of my colleagues, Nuhu Ribadu, you all know, the Nigerians know, was very brave in trying to identify those who were perpetrating acts and to have them arrested. Yes, some people said it was politically directed. But the point is, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But what we felt is, whether or not, if you're corrupt and you have stolen money from government, whether you're on this side of politics or on that side, the corruption is the same, and you ought to pay the price. So this was what we tried to do. Now, it was not as easy as the narrative that I tell you. All along the way, there were vested interests. I remember the issue of customs. when I turned attention to customs, and articles began to appear in the newspaper saying that Okonjo-Iweala was trying to bring back colonialism and bring crown agents and other people to take over and return us back to colonial rule, and constant attacks by people who were vested interests who didn't want any reform in the sector. I can take point by point places where the vested interests, of course, when you're also fighting corruption, it fights you back. So one of the things that fought me back was that, you know, campaigns were mounted. I wouldn't bore you with the information. You know, mounted, trying to attack and discourage various members of the team from working in the team and from doing the work. But in short, we persisted, we made successes, which are material today. Because of the debt relief we got, Nigeria got a rating for the first time in its history. We invited Fitch and Standard & Poor's to rate us. We'd never had a rating before. We got a BB- rating. We were able to go to the capital markets, attract investment. And what we thought is that we would now turn attention in the next bit to looking at what was happening in the sectors and trying to see how we could make these reforms work better for those at the bottom end of the ladder. Because we could see we were facing problems of unemployment, inequality, and exclusion. And these were the next steps that were to be tackled. And that is what we are trying to do now in this next administration. Having stabilized the macro, turn around and focus on how do we now create jobs for those who are unemployed. How can we sleep when more than 30% of our youth don't have jobs? How can we rest peacefully when our graduates come out and all of them cannot work? How is it that we have unskilled people not employed? These are the problems we are tackling today, and that's the next. In the conclusions and looking forward, I outlined the areas that we should look on to do reforms, the next wave of reforms. And if you look, it's almost as if when we're looking at the present administration of President Jonathan, because many of those reforms that we set out are reforms that we have embarked on today to try to make sure that we do not allow inequality to become a destabilizing factor, more so than it is now in our economy. So let me stop there. I've spoken for almost 20 minutes. 25. 25. You see, I could go on and on and on. Can I end with an interesting, last anecdote? When we were doing the debt relief, it was very hard to get the G8 countries who owed most of our debt to listen. You know, they had heard so much about give us debt relief, give us debt relief. And we had to devise, I had to think of ways and means to get the attention of these G8 ministers. So the first person I tried to see then was Gordon Brown, who has since become a very close friend. But when we went to the annual meetings of the World Bank in Dubai, it was in 2003, I think. And I asked to see Gordon Brown. His people said, oh, his calendar was booked. And he didn't have any time. And I guessed immediately that he didn't want to hear anything about debt relief. So I said, no. I only want to see him for 2 minutes, just to tell him what we're doing in Nigeria. And so they arranged a 2-minute meeting. I think the British call it a brush past or something like that. And in those 2 minutes, and I started the meeting by saying, Mr. Chancellor, I don't want to ask you for anything. So he looked surprised. I said, I just came to tell you what we're doing. We're embarked on this set of reforms, which we think we need for the economy, and I just want you to watch what we're doing. If at the end of 18 months you think we've done a good job, then I'll come and talk to you about some other subject linked to the reforms. That was 2 minutes, wasn't it? And I said, thank you very much. So I think Gordon was intrigued with this approach. And then he, started paying attention. So I didn't ask him to do anything. Now I remember with Siniscalco, who was the finance minister of Italy, I tried everything to see Siniscalco, and his people kept blocking this. And then we went to Davos. I think it was the winter of 2004, and I was kind of desperate. I'd tried to get appointments through everybody, it wouldn't work. And I heard that Siniscalco, Domenico Siniscalco, who is also a good acquaintance, was attending Davos. So we got hold of his people and said, look, we're all here. Can I have a meeting just to tell him what we're doing? And he said, no, the minister is all booked up. So I said, fine. So where is he now? They said he's in a meeting upstairs. So I left my own meeting and planted myself at the door and waited. And when he came out of his Davos session, he was immediately surrounded by all these people. And I just slipped under them and tugged his shirt, his jacket. And he turned around and said, who is this? And I said, I'm the finance minister of Nigeria. Your people have not let me see you. So I have to resort to desperate measures. And again, he was intrigued, and he said, and I said, all I want is 2 minutes over a cup of coffee. He said, you've got it. And that was how I talked to him about the debt. And, he was able to assist. For the rest, I think God played a role. So we are very religious in Nigeria. But I have to tell you, in each and every country that we were seeking debt relief from, either the deputy finance minister, the finance minister, the advisor to the finance minister was a former colleague of mine from the World Bank. In the UK, it was Nick Stern, Lord Nick Stern, who had just left as chief economist, and he was also able to now work with me after the first contact with Gordon to convince him. In Japan, it was Kiyoshi Kodera. The Japanese didn't even want to hear about debt relief. They don't give that kind of thing to developing countries. But Kiyoshi was able to tell his minister, he was senior advisor, that this woman is a trustworthy person. In Germany, they didn't want to talk to us. Kayo Kokfeser, who was my former boss at the World Bank, was the deputy finance minister. In France, the new executive secretary of the Paris Club was Emmanuel, what's Emmanuel's last name, who was also, who had been an alternative executive director at the World Bank. So I think God lined it up, don't you? How could that be? That with all these difficulties, he lined up all these people so that when I made the pitch, there was actually somebody somewhere who said, this woman makes sense. We know her. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.